Mark, would you take it from there?
Yes,
and I gather
absolutely.
you're going to pour a little bit of cold water on the optimism expressed earlier.
I might be the skunk at the garden party. I want to thank the organizers again for inviting me to participate here. I'm just getting used to the idea that I also have to issue a disclaimer that my views expressed today are mine alone and have nothing to do with the Commissioner or its employees, the SEC. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to talk about two stylized facts and convince you that there are implications of those stylized facts for the timing of orderly liquidation activities under Title II. And in particular, I think there's a major conceptual problem with identifying the point at which the organization is put into the orderly liquidation process. So the stylized facts are, first of all, that book measures of equity capital are not the same as market values or market measures of equity capital. And the market measures are going to be the ones that determine whether short-term depositors run, not the book values, the market values. Because that's probably a better estimate of what the firm is really worth at any point in time. And even if supervisors know better, unless they can convince the market, that's the information, that's the assessed values on which the market's going to act. So that's one stylized fact. Book and market are different. Second stylized fact is that regulatory discretion is absolutely crucial, not only to the orderly liquidation process, but also to all of Basel III, just as it has been absolutely crucial to Basel I and Basel II. So there's a pillar that says, here's the formula. There's a second pillar that says, and supervisors are going to keep after the banks to make sure that they maintain enough loss-absorbing capacity. And my claim is that supervisors haven't done a very good job of that, and I think there are very good reasons why they have not. So let me talk about the first fact. This is the easy one. All of the accounting rules, the capital adequacy rules, are written in terms of GAAP accounting or IFRS accounting. And the accounting has some options available to managers. And when things are going badly, the managers are going to exploit those options, purposefully or otherwise, and they're going to view the loan portfolio as not quite as risky as someone else might. They're going to view their level 3 securities as a little bit more valuable than somebody else might. And the fact of the matter is that book measures of asset values are going to fall much more slowly than market measures as the firm gets into trouble. Now, the best example of this comes from an op-ed piece that Andy Koretsky and Hal Scott had in the Financial Times in 2009. And they said, think about the following 5 firms. This is 2009, the end of the year. Bear Stearns, Washington Mutual, Lehman, Wachovia, and Merrill Lynch. What do they have in common? They all failed. And they all had, at the prior quarter end before the failure, a Tier 1 capital ratio between 12 and 16%. So it wasn't 4 or 5, it was 12 to 16. So I think trying to assure economically adequate capital through Pillar 2 in a mechanism where all the rules are defined in terms of book values, I think that's a very, very difficult task. It might be impossible. Now, supervisory discretion. Recently, I had occasion to read a report by David Beim about what he thought was the supervisory culture in the New York Fed before the crisis hit. And he felt, and told Bill Dudley, who commissioned the study, that there was a certain over acquiescence to the large firms' opinions. There was a certain reluctance to disagree with other people in the regulatory staff. And he went on to make some recommendations about how that could be improved. Well, we can look back and say, how has not the New York Fed, but how has the regulatory system actually performed over, say, the last 25 years? So I have a paper where I looked at 25 largest banks for 25 years, 1986 to 2011, and I used their equity volatilities and their equity values to figure out one-year default probabilities. So I had 625 bank years, and in 48% of those bank years, the one-year default probability was greater than 1%. Now, is that a big number or a small number? The little bit that I've been able to see inside the Basel documents claimed, suggested that there was a calibration of credit requirements, asset weights, that was supposed to yield a 1/10% default probability. So you say, well, 1% is not so bad. Well, it turns out that 28% of those bank years had default probabilities in excess of 5%, one-year default probabilities. So I suggest that whatever were the details underlying this, the supervisors were not quickly rectifying firms that had become over-levered by forcing them to curtail assets or to issue new equity. And it wasn't just one or two firms that had big problems. It turns out that there were 12 firms. So out of 25 largest firms in different years, they're different banks. So there were 30 banks altogether. 12 of them had a default probability greater than 1% for 5 out of the 25 years. And 5 of them had a default probability greater than 1% for 10 or more out of the 25 years. So this looks like a pattern that lingers for a while. And I don't think that this supervisory linchpin of the Basel system has actually provided us with very safe banks. Will supervisors do better in the future? I think Paul said they'll do better, but they might not do well. I hope that's not putting words in your mouth. And I think that history tells us that this is a very difficult job. Now, why? Turns out that monetary policy discretion works pretty well. The Open Market Committee, the Bank of England, behave in a certain way for a while. They convince the markets that they're going to be reasonable about monetary growth, and they get a lot of credibility. But the supervisory discretion seems not to work so well. And I think the reason is that with monetary policy, if you tighten policy, there are going to be a large number of people who are affected, some of whom are hurt. But it's very diffuse. Whereas if you introduce a restrictive supervisory rule, or worse yet, you go to a particular large firm and say, you are over-levered, you must sell shares now, there is a specific set of people who are affected by those discussions. And they're going to push back very hard. And they're going to have really good reasons, plausible reasons, why now's not the right time to issue more equity. And the supervisors, they know they're dealing with a difficult problem. Opaque assets, opaque trading strategies, question of whether there is a liquidity discount in the market that's going to go away in a short time. So they're naturally going to want to be very certain before they impose specific identifiable losses on large firm shareholders. And what do you do when you're not sure what to do? You wait for more information. And what happens historically is that in more cases than not, it's a deposit run, a short-term liability run that forces the supervisor to act. Well, when that happens, the short-term liability holders believe that the market value of equity is virtually nil. And so at that point, the supervisor's got a Hobson's choice. I put in state money, or I let a large firm fail with unknown consequences for the rest of the society. So it's a very bad situation to let it get to that end point. And because there is this very specific pushback associated with supervisory discretion, I don't think it's reasonable to think that these same very hardworking, very well-meaning people are going to be able to make much different decisions going into the future. So that's probably more controversial than my accounting statement. But those are the two things that I think bear on this orderly liquidation. So now let's think about the decision to pull the trigger on orderly liquidation. You might hope that there's going to be a deposit run, and that's going to make everybody understand the firm's not solvent, the firm's not feasible, and it'll be obvious when it's time to pull the trigger. But suppose there's a firm with a big fat tranche of bail-inable debt that takes losses before the deposits and the liabilities. Well, the liability holders at the point of insolvency don't necessarily run. If they believe in orderly liquidation, in fact, they say, oh, we got lots of time. There's still lots more assets than our non-subordinated senior claims. So they don't run. And the shareholders at that point are controlling a firm with low or negative equity with an ability to continue funding itself, and that gives them extremely bad risk-taking incentives. Now, sooner or later, you say the supervisors will catch on, and that's fine. I'm sure they will, because among other things, the price of these bail-in bonds is going to start falling. But my suspicion is it's going to take a while, and by the time the supervisors get around to declaring, by the time the Treasury Secretary gets around to declaring that the firm is in danger of default, which is the language in the Dodd-Frank Act, the value, the market value of these bail-in bonds is going to be much smaller than it started out being, and there's may not be enough real value in those bonds to recapitalize all of the junior subsidiaries. So when they meet in Brisbane and try to decide how much bail-in capital, bail-in bonds to have, I hope they pick a big number, because I think that whatever the number, it's not going to be worth nearly that much by the time the liquidation actually gets started. Now, if we have a firm that doesn't have a lot of uninsured liabilities, if we have one of the smaller of our 18 identified SIFIs that have big retail deposit bases, then they're going to be able to continue financing themselves even longer, despite the fact that they might be insolvent, and the pressure on the supervisor to look at a firm with arguably a positive accounting capital ratio and a continued ability to fund itself, and the supervisor needs to say, no, 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 I know what it looks like, but you're really insolvent. You're really on the verge of default. So I find myself being very skeptical about the way this orderly liquidation is going to get put into place. How can we make things better? Well, I think the best way to make things better is to try to stay away from situations where the assets aren't worth much more than the liabilities. I think that's going to require earlier intervention. At early intervention, if the capital ratio is 5 or 10 instead of 0 or 1, the value transfers between bondholders and shareholders, or between shareholders and taxpayers, the value transformations are much smaller, and there's much less reason to resist for the shareholders when they're told to raise more capital. So I think we need to intervene early to maintain relatively high levels of capital, as opposed to waiting for the runs or waiting for the incipient runs. And then the next thing, I think, is that even though there are some reasons, maybe the stress tests in particular, that book values are getting better, I still think we need to figure out a way to bring forward-looking market assessments into rules that define the things that supervisors are supposed to do. So just as in the old days there was a discussion about monetary discretion versus monetary rules, I think we have the same discussion to be had, and at least recent history suggests to me that the rules might be better. Not perfect in every situation, but they might be better. So let me close by saying that I hope I've at least gotten you to think about the possibility that orderly liquidation is not really a solution to too big to fail. And I hope you can see the possibility that orderly liquidation is likely to get us right back to where we've been historically, which is confronting a firm that has relatively little assets exceeding its short-term liabilities, and being forced as supervisors to make emergency responses under a lot of external pressure. Thank you.